Okay, so today we're going to do part 2 of British Israel. Now, let's set a timer for this one, because I have to watch myself. So, if you were here for part 1, great. This is part 2. You already know what it's about. If you weren't here for part 1, I'll go through it in a second. Not the whole thing, but just a few slides, so we can recap. But we're talking about British Israel, part 2, British Israel. So I think just to preface this, there are a lot of different churches and organizations that have come across this teaching and teach it along with the other teachings. We're not really associated with them. There are also, when I was searching for this online, there are also white supremacists who promote this. We are not them. We are not a cult also. Our interest in this is simply that the Bible talks about promises given to the nation of Israel that would happen in the future, and our interest is working out where Israel has gone, because Israel seems to have disappeared in about 700 BC, and those promises were left unfulfilled. So our interest is working out where Israel has gone, what nation it has become, and seeing those promises fulfilled through that nation, as where our interest comes through. And with British Israel, if you can hit maybe like F5, I think it is, or Control L maybe, or just like view full screen, one of them. Yeah, that's the one. One thing with British Israel is that there's lots of different ideas that get promoted around it. That, this was a depiction of these people back in 700 BC, and then, 1,000 years later, there's a depiction of these people, and they sort of look the same. They must be the same people. I think it's important that our foundation for this prophecy is based in the Bible, and that our understanding comes from that first and foremost, rather than joining dots that might not need to be joined, And so, we should first look to the Bible and see what the Bible says and see if we can match up anything with the Bible. So to recap from the last time, if you can just click on it. There we go. Sorry, that's my bad. I probably didn't click hard enough. Part 1, we looked at the nation of Israel, and we looked at how Israel came to be. There were promises given to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, Isaac and Jacob, which went on to Israel and his children, and the specific children. We went on to see how Israel split into two kingdoms, a north kingdom, which was then named Israel, or Ephraim, it's referred to sometimes, and a southern kingdom, which was named Judah. And we went on to see also that when they split into the north and the south kingdoms, that the north kingdom was heavily involved in idolatry. All of the kings from that point onwards were evil, and the people of the land were involved in idolatry and sacrificing the children, all types of terrible things. And so the Lord decided he would judge them at that point, and he cast them out of the land. The Assyrians came, took over the land, took them out of that land, and took them back into Assyria. So a couple of the promises that were given beforehand to Jacob's line was that they would be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations would be of him. And so this phrase, company of nations, in different Bible translations, it's translated as community of nations. It's translated as even many nations. It's translated as a multitude of nations. So what we see coming up to this point that we looked at in the last presentation was that Israel had not become that, and certainly the North Kingdom had not become that. They were half of all of Israel, I guess. And so they definitely had not fulfilled being a multitude of nations or a company of nations. Same thing was promised from Jacob. It was passed down through Joseph's sons and given to Ephraim. And it's talking about Ephraim, it's talking to Manasseh about Ephraim. It says, "But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And so that's talking about Ephraim, who was part of the northern kingdom that split away. And again, what we see is that when they were taken away to Assyria, at this point in time, they had not become a multitude of nations. So it seems that that promise must be fulfilled later on in the future. Deuteronomy 33, again, it talks about the promise. Moses gave this promise to the line of Joseph. And it says, he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. And they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. So it was prophesied that these people would spread and push to the ends of the earth. And again, what we see at this point in time is that that had not happened. They had only occupied Israel, and they had been taken away to Assyria, which is not the ends of the earth. So these prophecies still had yet to be fulfilled. And so what we see is that Israel, the northern kingdom, was taken away over about 45 years via different conquests of different kings of the Assyrians, and they were taken into Assyria. And from that point on, they were essentially lost. There's no mention of them from this point on, and so in terms of history, that's as much as we know about them. And so the first question is, number one, how do we know that they didn't return to Israel? Because a lot of people say that, oh no, they just went back. Like they would have gone home after the Babylonians took over, and after the Babylonians returned the southern tribe back to their lands, they would have returned the northern tribe. But what we see is that there's a few reasons why that is not the case. I don't want to dwell on it too much tonight, but just in terms of Zechariah, Zechariah was writing about 200 years after the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom of Israel captive. And he writes 200 years later as if they had not yet returned. And so he says, and I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph, and will bring them again to place them. So he's saying that as if they have not yet been placed. And he goes on to say, I will hiss for them and gather them, for I have redeemed them, and they shall increase as they have increased. And he's talking about a future time again, talking as if right now they have not been gathered, they have not been taken back to their homeland. And we know that there were historical writers at the time of Jesus as well. Josephus, we looked at last time, he mentioned that they didn't know where the 10 tribes had gone, that they had disappeared somewhere beyond the Euphrates, and that at this time they must be a huge number. And so, yeah, it's confirmed from several different sources that they did not return to Israel. And there was this prophecy which was given to Hosea. I've always said Hosea, but I think it's actually Hosea. And it was given to him this sort of like practical prophecy. And so in Hosea 1, verse 2, it says, the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, go, take unto thee a wife of the whoredoms and the children of the whoredoms, for the land hath committed a great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So Hosea basically, the Lord said to Hosea, go take a wife of these people, and you're going to have a few children with her, and they're going to represent Ephraim and Israel. And the names of them represent different judgments that the Lord gave to the northern kingdom. And so the first one is called Jezreel, which means God sows or God scatters. And he says, the rest isn't super relevant. The next one is conceived, and her name was Lorahama. That meant, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. So that was the second judgment. The third one was called Lo Ami, for ye are not my God, and I will not. Ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. So basically, the Lord, through this prophecy, is saying to the people of Ephraim and Israel, the house of Israel, number one, I'm going to sow you throughout the nations. You're going to be scattered. Number two, gone the wrong way. Number two, he will not have mercy on them. Number three, you will not be my people, and I will not be your God. And there's this interesting verse in the next chapter, and it says, therefore, behold, I will hedge up thy way with thorns, and make a wall that she shall not find her paths. And that's talking about the northern tribe of Israel, that when they were taken away, that they would not find their way back, immediately at least. And they would sort of lose sight of who they were, and they would sort of be assimilated into the nations that they went into, so much so that they would forget who they would forget where they were from, and they wouldn't find their path back. And so this is a really important verse to remember in terms of British Israel, was that these people were to be forgotten, they were to be lost, and that was part of the purpose of it. So we'll go on to the next question: when should this come to pass? And this is talking about when should the prophecies that we saw earlier, which were given to Jacob, to Joseph, to Ephraim, when would they come to pass? Does the Bible tell us when we should expect these things to happen, and when could we look out for it? And so in Genesis 49, it says, "And Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days." So before giving the blessings or the prophecies, I guess, to Jacob's sons, he gave the context in the time that it would happen, and he's talking about the last days. And again, what we see is that when Moses also gave the prophecy about Ephraim and Manasseh, or Ephraim in particular, spreading out and pushing to the ends of the earth, again, it was the same thing that he was talking about in the latter days, it says here. So he says, "For I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you. Evil will befall you in the latter days." And again, he goes on to talk about the rest of it in the prophecy there. And so what we see is that this was to happen in the latter days, or the last days. And latter days just means the later days, essentially, the days at the end of the age. And this is it refers to different things in different passages, but usually it's talking about the time of the Gentiles, or from Christ's first coming to his second coming. Sometimes it's talking about right before Christ's second coming. Sometimes it's talking about Christ's second coming. And sometimes it's talking about just after, or as Christ is establishing his kingdom on the earth. And so what we see is that in John confirms that. He says, "Little children, it is the last time. And as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time." So he confirmed that we are living in the last time, and this age is the last time. And so this is when we should expect these prophecies to be fulfilled. Now the question is, when were they to increase in number? Because again, it could be referring to after the millennium, after Jesus returns. But let's have a look. It says in Isaiah 10, "The remnant shall return, even to the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God." So if you weren't here for the last one, there was a prophecy that we looked at right at the end, that at the end days, that Israel would once again be rejoined with the southern kingdom of Judah, and they would be one nation. And so the promise here is that the remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God. "For though the people Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant of them shall return. The consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness." And if we're looking at a time frame here, what we see is that first, the people of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, and then from that, a remnant shall return. And so first, they must be as the sand of the sea. Again, what we see in Romans 11, very similar. It says, "For I would not, brethren, that ye be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness is in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." So again, fullness of Gentiles, or the fullness of nations, which is talking about the company of nations. And it talks about that must first come in, the fullness of the nations, and then the blindness which has happened to Israel will be removed, and they'll come to understand things. So then the question is, what are we looking for then? If we know that, just going back, actually, with the latter days, if we know that it's going to happen before Israel recognizes, who they are, that the fullness of Gentiles will come in, then, and we know that we are in the latter days, we know that we're right at the end by looking at Revelation, looking at the prophecies of 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 vials, we know, which is essentially like a roadmap of time that Jesus first was on earth to the time that he will return. We know that we're right at the end of that, and that there is very little yet to be fulfilled, and that Christ's return could be any moment. If we know that we are in that time, and we know that the northern kingdom, Israel, were to expand into the fullness of nations just before the Lord's return, then we should expect that we should be able to look out at the nations that exist now, and we should be able to see and identify what that nation is, because it should fulfill this prophecy. Because surely there is not enough time from now until Christ's return that another nation could rise up, and it could be that nation. So it must be a nation that we can see and is around today. So what are we looking for? Are we looking for a people which is scattered all over the place? Are we looking for a village here, a village here, a village here, a couple of people here, a couple of people here? Or are we looking for a nation of people? And again, we're going to look at a few scriptures here which back up the fact that we are indeed looking for a nation of people. There might be, individuals scattered here and there, but as a whole, Israel should be a nation. And in Amos, it talks about that Israel would be scattered among the nations, that they would be sifted like a sieve throughout the earth. Hosea, again, it talks about that they would be wanderers among the nations. But it does say, Hosea chapter 2, we looked at Hosea 1 before, where it had the 3 children and the prophecy was given, and they each represented a part of that prophecy. It talks about Israel and Jeremiah also being divorced from the Lord. And in that same analogy, in Hosea 2, it says that after a point that Israel has been divorced from the Lord, it says that the Lord would call her back. And it says here, therefore, behold, I will allure her, and I will bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. So it says that at some point, the Lord would show mercy upon this people who had been scattered. In Jeremiah 31, it says, thus said the Lord, the people which were left of the sword found grace in the wilderness, even Israel, when I went to cause him to rest. And so again, we see that at some point, they did find mercy and they found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord caused them to rest. Ezekiel 37 is the prophecy of the dry bones of Israel, and how these dry bones sort of come together, and the gift of life is breathed into them. And it represents again Israel and how that they were dead and they will rise again. But what's interesting is the beginning part, that the bones are scattered. And in verse 7 it says, so I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And it talks about these bones which were scattered coming together into a body, or into bodies. And again, this is sort of prophetic that the nation of Israel was scattered but would come together before the breath of life was breathed into them. Ezekiel 37, later on in the chapter, it says there was this other prophecy which was given to Ezekiel. And again, it's sort of practical demonstration of prophecy. And he was given 2 sticks, one to represent Judah, one to represent Ephraim or Israel. And he would join them together and they would be one. But when it talks about it, it says, moreover, thou son of man, take the one stick and write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel, his companions. So one was to represent Judah and his companions, which we know are now gathered together, the southern kingdom. But the other was to represent, as it says, for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. And again, that was to represent Joseph and his companions, and sort of saying that they were together. And so this kingdom that was together and this other nation that was together would be joined. And so again, it points to the fact that they would be combined into a nation somewhere. And this is probably the most compelling verse to look at. Micah 4 says, "In that day, saith the Lord, will I assemble her that halteth, and I will gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted. And I will make her that is halted a remnant," again talking about the southern kingdom this time, Judah. But it goes on to say, "And her that was cast far off," talking about Israel, "a strong nation. And the Lord shall reign over them in the Mount Zion, henceforth, even forever." So that second part is talking about when the Lord returns. But before that, it talks about her that was cast off being a strong nation. And so the Bible confirms that we are looking for a nation, a people who have been gathered together through the mercy of God, who are Israel, essentially. So where should we look? Does the Bible give us any indication where we should look for this nation? And it does. It talks in Jeremiah 3, it says, "In those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel. They shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers." So it talks about them coming from the land of the north. Hosea 11 says, this is from the New King James, it says, "They shall walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his sons shall come trembling from the west." So we know from the north, from the west. In Jeremiah 31, it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O ye nations, and declare it in the isles afar off. And say, He that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock." Now, when it talks about the isles afar off, when it talks about isles, usually it talks about that in terms of the Mediterranean Sea and the islands thereof, or the places which are available by going through the Mediterranean Sea, its coasts and distant countries or coastlines which come off that. But this is talking about isles afar off, so it's talking about further than that, which is quite interesting, and quite interesting that it talks about isles or islands. And so when you look at all of this, you look at the company of nations, you look at all of these prophecies, it sort of all points to Great Britain being the inheritor of these promises. And we're going to look at it in detail. To start with, we're going to look at the company of nations, or to be a multitude of nations. And no other nation fulfills this better than Great Britain. And you can just have a look at the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is an association of 56 different countries, the vast majority of which are former territories of the British Empire. And they're not actually, they don't have any legal ties between them, but they're connected through the use of the English language and their historical ties. And this all, again, stems from the British Empire. As the British Empire expanded, went to all these different countries, we're one of them, and it's the home to 2.5 billion people, which is 1/3 of the world's population. And so if you're looking for a nation which has become a company of nations, there's no other nation in the world which has done what Great Britain has done, and has has spread, as the Bible said, to the very edges of the world. And it's literally the very edges of the world. So if that's a good place to start, then let's look at the other prophecies and the other markers which were given and which were told that this nation would embody. So Genesis 12, a great and mighty nation. It's quite interesting that it's literally called Great Britain. And if you're naming a country, definitely put great at the beginning. Why not? A nation and a company of nations. Again, we see that's pretty clearly fulfilled. The chief of the nations. And so again, while the Commonwealth expanded, they were still the chief of those nations. Talks about the stars of heaven, or the numbers of the people being the stars of heaven and the sand upon the seashore. Innumerable, huge number. And again, that's exactly what we see. 2.5 billion, I think it was, which is crazy. Again, pushing the people together to the ends of the earth. That's exactly what they have done. Numbers, it talks about the seed shall be in many waters, again talking about expansion, talking about a seafaring nation, the strength amongst the sea. And again, that's exactly what we see with Great Britain. That's exactly how they reached all of these different nations. Isaiah 27, it talks about they would blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit. And what we see is that as the British Empire spread, not only did they increase in number in fruit, I guess, but they also spread the message of the gospel, and they brought the Bible to pretty much all of those lands which they explored to and spread out to. And again, that's exactly what we have here. How we have the Bible is through that expansion of that nation, and through that nation, a lot of nations were blessed. And again, it talks about in Isaiah that ye are my witnesses. And again, that's exactly what we see has happened. Deuteronomy 15 says, reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. And what we've seen is that through, especially the last couple of world wars, Britain has always been hotly contested, and despite people's best intentions to take it over, has not yet been taken over. Leviticus 26 is quite an interesting one, because I'll read it out to you. It talks about, and if ye will not for all this hearken unto me, but walk contrary unto me, then I will walk contrary unto you also in fury, and I, even I, will chastise you 7 times for your sins. And so there was this prophecy that if the people of Israel turned away from the Lord, that they would be chastised for 7 times. And 7 times, essentially, a time is a year in terms of prophecy, and a day is equal to a year. So a year is equal to 360 days, which would be 360 years. And so when it talks about 7 times, we're looking at a period of 7 times 360, which is 2,520 years. So if this is a nation which we are talking about, if Israel has turned or has become this nation of Great Britain, then what we should see is that they should be sort of cast down for about 2,520 years, and then after that point, that they should come into knowledge, or they should come into expansion, and we should be able to see that. So what's quite interesting is that if we go from the date that Jeroboam, if you remember Jeroboam was the first king after Solomon who separated the north and the south kingdoms. And so he was in the north, and he was a bad king, and all the kings after him in the north were bad. If we take, that was about 930 BC. So if we go 2,520 years after that, we should see something happen. What we see happen in the nation of Great Britain is that is the time of the Reformation, or actually just at the end of the Reformation, about 1590, when the Reformation was just concluding. And the Reformation was all about the nation of Great Britain, or the Church of England and England, breaking away from the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church, which we know to be a false doctrine, to be the Antichrist. And so what we see is that after that time, that they came into this knowledge that what they were doing was wrong, wasn't in the Bible, and that they wanted to follow the Bible, essentially, was what the Reformation was all about. And so it's interesting to see that after that period of time that sort of lines up. And again, what we see is that if you take it from the point of their captivity, which was between 720 BC to about 676 BC, then you take 2,520 years, you add it to that, you get to this time which is between 1800 and 1845, which in Great Britain was known as, referred to as, from 1815 to 1914, was referred to as the Imperial Century by historians, which essentially was when Great Britain spread out, had this huge boom, and we see that in that time they took about 26 million kilometers squared of territory, and roughly 400 million people were added to the British Empire. So this huge expansion we see happen after that period of time of the chastisement, we see this boom, and again, that knowledge boom after the same period. So it seems to be that either way that you look at it, that they had been chastised for this particular amount of time, and after that, there was this blessing, and they came into knowledge, they came into the inheritance of this promise, which is pretty interesting. There's also, in Hosea 6, there's this prophecy, verse 1, I'll read it out to you. It says, "Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he is torn, he will heal us. He is smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us, and the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight." And we know that, again, in prophecy, a day can be 1,000 years. A day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, as it says. And so what's quite interesting is that 2,000 years after Hosea writing this, we come to this year, which is 12,000, that's way in the future, 1215 AD, which is when the Magna Carta was signed. And I don't know if you know what that is. I had to Google it. I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was. It literally means the Great Charter. And it was the first written constitution in European history. And what's interesting is that essentially it was saying, what was written was that no man was above the law. And what we see 2,000 years previous to that is that Israel had basically said, nah, we're above the law. We can do whatever we want. We'll live however we want. And there won't be any consequences. There were consequences, and what we see 2,000 years later is that this declaration was signed that they wouldn't be above the law anymore, which is quite interesting, and it ties in quite well. So, if it seems like it's Great Britain that the promises of Israel have occurred to, then is it possible that we can trace Great Britain back to where Israel was lost? Is that possible? And the interesting thing, well, not the interesting thing, but an unfortunate thing, I guess, is that history is not the most complete in many occasions throughout this time. And so what we see is that people have been lost, nations have started in places and have been lost in other places, and we don't really know what happened to them. Like literally all we have is diggings up of people, of places, writings that they can find from these things. Some writings from the past, but again, not very many. But what we can see is that it's definitely a possibility, and that a nation could travel within this time and take over Great Britain. So we're going to start here. So Israel is down here, if you can see it. And what we see happen is that the northern tribe, Israel, or Ephraim, was taken over to here, to Assyria, and to the Medes. So actually, what I should have started with is... we'll start here. So this was in about 7th century BC. Now, what we see is there's this interesting group of people called the Scythians. And the Scythians, they think, came from around here and ended up coming around this area in the very time that the 10 tribes were lost. So from around 680 BC to around 600 BC. What we see is that this group of people, the Scythians, were in the very area. So again, Israel was taken captive around here, and this is the very area that these people were also in around the exact same time. And we see that they expanded this way, they expanded this way, they expanded this way. Around 600 BC, the Medes, the nation of the Medes, pushed these people up towards the north. I feel like a weatherman. Up towards the north, the northern front, and sort of pushed them out of this area. So we come to about 600 to 3rd century BC, and this people called the Scythians, which I referred to as a nomadic Iranian tribes, because they came from what is known as modern-day Iran or Iraq. They were pushed, again, upwards this way to the Pontic steppe. I forgot to look that up. I think you say steppe. It's not like steppe or something. Eh? Yeah, we'll go with steppe. They were pushed up towards this area through 600 to 3rd century BC. So they were pushed north and they were pushed west, which is, again, on track for where we're looking for. Now, this other group, called the Sarmatians, seem to be related to the Scythians. And these guys, Sarmatians, they sort of occupied this sort of area, and again, were sort of related to the Scythians. They ended up pushing these guys this way and sort of assimilating them or getting rid of them towards 100 AD. So the Scythians were sort of absorbed in the Sarmatians as they were moving north and west. And again, these Sarmatians were also seen as a wandering, nomadic Iranian tribe, which was moving that way. Now, the Scythians also had this other name, which was called the Sakai or the Saka. And anyway, what we see is that the Sarmatians ended up taking this area. This is the Roman Empire around 1st century AD. So we see the Sarmatians are in this area. You've got your Germanic tribes over here. And around 1st century AD, the Sarmatians and the Germanian tribes sort of working together to encroach upon the Roman Empire space. Around 4th century AD, the Sarmatians joined the Goths and other Germanic tribes and ended up settling in the Western Roman Empire. So all of this sort of area is where we see these guys who have started all the way down here, have made their way slowly up here, combined with these guys, settled in this area. And then we see in about 450 AD, shortly after, that a group of people, the Anglo-Saxons, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, different tribes of what people think are the same people, moved from this area and occupied Britain. So there are a couple of Romans, there's bits and pieces of various people occupying at the time. But it sounds like from the vast number of these guys, the Anglo-Saxons, coming through, they sort of destroyed everyone who was there and pushed out anyone that was still there into this area down here. And so, as I said before, the Scythians also had the other name, the Sakai. And what's quite interesting is that the word Saxon is derived from the Persian Sakai or Sak. So it's quite interesting that these could be the exact same people that we've seen migrate throughout Europe and that have eventually come to take over Britain. And so it's very possible, that it is Israel that has moved through that land, come to this isle, the north, the west, exactly where the Bible says that we should look. So that's really interesting. I'll read out a couple of quotes for you. It says, there's this guy, a German historian called Petrus Albanus, and he's known as the father of Saxon historiography. And he says, the Saxons were descended from the ancient Sakai and eventually were called the Saxons. So exactly that people that we looked at. Another quote from a book says, thus we see that Israel's grave was the Saxons' birthplace. So exactly where we see Israel disappear was where we saw this other group come through. And they say, for the Saxons first appear in history coming from Eastern Europe from Media shortly after 700 BC. The Israelites disappeared shortly after 700 BC, while also migrating from Eastern Europe into Media. Two such large migrations at the same time in place are hardly likely. It seems obviously that they were identical, that the Saxons were Israelites under a new name. The other interesting thing is that within the Saxon language, which we have now adopted a lot of, where a lot of our English language comes from, that there are all these Persian words in there. And it seems to be that they must have come from that area to have used that language, and that's where the language comes from in their language, which is quite interesting. And another interesting thing, again, talking about the Saxons, they think the word Saxon comes from Sakei, or Sakei Suna, which means the sons of Sakei. And there was a prophecy given Genesis 21 that talks about, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And in Amos, it talks about the house of Isaac, when it's talking about Israel, that northern kingdom. And it is quite remarkably similar, isn't it? That Saxons, Isaac's sons, very similar in language. And it would be amazing, if it was, that's where the name came from. And I read a couple of other articles about why people didn't believe that Israel became Great Britain, and a lot of it stems from the fact that people were saying, the culture was different, the language was different, and they didn't worship one God, but they worshiped many. And it's quite interesting that, if they actually looked at the Bible, they would see that this is a group that doesn't worship one God. They worship all these other gods from the nations round about. The purpose of them being taken into Assyria was that they would be sifted among the nations. They were to lose their identity. They were no longer circumcised. They adopted the language which they were taken into. And they would have adopted the customs as well, because that's literally what they were doing in the northern, when they were in Israel. And so it seems to me that that's exactly what was prophesied. Their argument against it was exactly what was prophesied. It's really interesting stuff. And just to finish off, the question is, what happens next? Because the prophecy again was that Israel would be joined to the southern kingdom once again. Hosea 1, verse 10, it said, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye are the sons of the living God. So it was prophesied that they would somehow find out, or it would be said unto them, that they are the sons of the living God, that they are this nation, which is quite interesting. The next verse, it says, then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together into one nation, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. And that's talking about, again, appointing the king, which will be Christ, over the nation. But it does talk about them being the sea of the sand of the sea, which is innumerable, this huge number. So is it likely that 2.5 billion or whatever people will go back to Israel literally? I don't think there's enough room for that. And so how exactly that will happen, we're yet to find out. Might just be representatives, who knows. Hosea 3 says, for the children of Israel will abide many days without king, without a prince, without a sacrifice, without an image, and without an ephod, without teraphim. Afterwards shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Again, that they would turn to seek the Lord. Ezekiel 37, just to finish, I think, it says, "And say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whether they be gone, and will gather them on every side and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel. One king shall be king to them all. They shall be no more two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms at all." And so that's the prophecy that was given, that they would join together. And again, when exactly that is going to happen is a bit dubious. I was talking to Dad earlier about it. And there's a few events towards the end that we don't know whether it will happen before Christ's return, whether it will happen at Christ's return, whether it will happen just after, as he's setting up his kingdom. Whether whether Great Britain will find out somehow that they are recognize that they are from Israel. Who knows exactly what will happen, whether that will turn, whether, people will come from the lands when they recognize that and will come to Israel. Who knows exactly how it will happen, but the promise is that it will happen at some point very soon, it would seem. And so, just this really interesting prophecy and really interesting how it all works together. Again, that's not to say, some people say that you're trying to find Israel because Israel is saved, Israel is all righteous. But we know that salvation is separate from this, and that salvation, because when you receive the Holy Spirit, you baptize, you repent, that sort of thing. And so that this is just separate. This is simply finding where this nation has gone, where the promises, where we should look for the promises to be fulfilled, and where we should look for that nation to return and to be joined again with the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's it. I'll leave it there.